The unraveling of a progressive icon. The Georgetown Incident. Part I. The architecture of expectation. To fully comprehend the seismic nature of the political collapse that occurred on that Tuesday evening, one must first understand the atmosphere of near-religious fervor that permeated the Georgetown University campus in the hours preceding the event. It was January 13th, 2026, a crisp winter day where the biting wind off the Potomac River did nothing to dampen the enthusiasm of the student body. The venue was Gaston Hall, a breathtaking neo-Gothic auditorium with soaring vaulted ceilings and intricate wood carvings that evoke the grandeur of a cathedral, or, as many students jokingly noted, the magical school of Hogwarts. This was a space reserved for heads of state and historical figures, and, on this night, it was hosting the undisputed superstar of the American left, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The event, billed as a climate leadership forum, had been the result of months of meticulous planning and resource pooling by three major student organizations: the Georgetown chapter of the Sunrise Movement, the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA Student Group, and the Climate Justice Coalition. For these groups, securing AOC was not just a scheduling win, it was a validation of their entire worldview. Posters plastered on every bulletin board and lamppost across campus featured that iconic image of her from her first campaign. Arms crossed, gaze intense, a look that promised defiance against the status quo. The slogan, "A green new future is possible," was emblazoned in bold letters, promising an evening of inspiration and revolutionary strategy. The demand for tickets had been unprecedented. When they went live 2 weeks prior, the entire allocation for the 1,500-seat auditorium sold out in under 3 hours. By 6 p.m., on the day of the event, a line of students stretched around the block, shivering in their coats, but buzzing with electric energy. These were the true believers, the generation that had grown up with the existential dread of climate change and saw Ocasio-Cortez not merely as a politician, but as a prophet of survival. They were the ones who had knocked on doors during the midterms, who wore Green New Deal pins, and who genuinely believed that democratic socialism offered the only viable off-ramp from ecological catastrophe. Inside the hall, the scene was one of frantic preparation. Maya Chen, the president of the Sunrise chapter, was backstage managing the run of show with the intensity of a military operation. They had planned every minute detail, a 45-minute keynote speech followed by 30 minutes of curated Q&A, culminating in a VIP reception for donors and student leaders. The technical team checked the 3-camera setup, intended to live stream the event to the world, convinced that the footage they were about to capture would go viral and further the cause. They were correct that the footage would go viral, though the content would be catastrophically different from the triumphant narrative they had envisioned. Part 2. The preparation of the prosecutor. While the students prepared for a coronation, a very different kind of preparation had taken place 3 weeks earlier in the offices of the Speaker of the House. Mike Johnson, a man often underestimated by his political opponents due to his mild-mannered demeanor, had approached this engagement not as a politician seeking a soundbite, but as a lawyer preparing a case. His chief of staff, Tom Emmer, had presented him with a folder 3 inches thick, a comprehensive dossier containing every financial disclosure, FEC filing, and credit card statement AOC had filed since taking office. Johnson had spent days poring over these documents. He compared the dry, indisputable facts of her expenditures against the soaring rhetoric of her public statements. He noted the purchase of an $89,000 Tesla Model S paid for in cash. He tallied the flight's 42 in just 18 months, with 28 of them in first or business class, during a period when she was publicly calling for the banning of private jets and the reduction of air travel. He reviewed the campaign finance reports detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars paid to consulting firms owned by her boyfriend and former chief of staff. For Johnson, this was not about partisan bickering. It was about exposing the fundamental disconnect between the Congresswoman's demands for public sacrifice and her private indulgence. He instructed his staff to request an invitation to the Georgetown event, knowing that university policy regarding elected officials would compel the organizers to say yes. He explicitly chose this venue over a cable news appearance or a congressional hearing because he wanted the confrontation to happen in front of her base. He wanted the students, her most ardent supporters, to see the receipts. When Johnson arrived at Gaston Hall at 6:45 p.m., he entered through a side door, accompanied by a small security detail and two staffers. Dressed in a simple navy suit with no tie, he looked unassuming. When approached by a nervous Maya Chen, he politely declined a front-row seat, opting instead for a spot in the back, row 20, where he could watch the proceedings unfold. He sat quietly, his thick folder distilled down to 30 devastating pages of evidence, waiting for his moment. Part 3. The Height of Hubris. Backstage, unaware of the forensic dismantling that awaited her, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was prepping with her team. 5 people were crammed into a small dressing room. Her communications director, Marcus Valdez, her press secretary, legislative aides, and her boyfriend, Riley Roberts. They had flown down from New York that afternoon, flying coach on this specific leg, a detail that would soon drip with irony. The mood was confident, bordering on arrogant. They ran through the talking points, emphasized the 10-year deadline to save the planet, pivot any questions about costs to the cost of inaction, and hit the social justice angles hard. When Marcus mentioned that Speaker Johnson had RSVP'd, the reaction was dismissive. "Let him come," AOC had said, checking her makeup in the mirror. "Let him embarrass himself in front of 1,500 progressives." They believed that any challenge from a Republican would be met with boos from the audience, providing a perfect girl boss viral moment where she could own the speaker. When she finally walked onto the stage at 7 p.m., the room erupted. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that lasted minutes before she could even speak. She was in her element. For 40 minutes, she delivered a masterclass in progressive oratory. She spoke of environmental racism, the tyranny of the billionaire class, and the moral necessity of the Green New Deal. She told the students that the wealthy, those with private jets and yachts, were the ones driving consumption, and that working people were being asked to bear the burden of a crisis they didn't create. "We can't afford not to act," she declared, her voice rising with practiced passion. "The only question is whether we have the courage." The students were enraptured, hanging on every word, believing they were witnessing history. She ended her speech to another standing ovation, soaking in the adoration of a crowd that saw her as their champion. Part 4. The Confrontation. The turning point came during the Q&A. As Maya Chen prepared to take a question from a student, Mike Johnson stood up in the back of the room. "I have a question first, if that's okay," he called out. The energy in the room shifted instantly from adoration to defensive hostility. There were murmurs and scattered boos, but AOC, maintaining her composure, nodded for him to proceed. Johnson began gently, complimenting her passion, before pivoting to the trap. "You've talked a lot tonight about sacrifice. I'm curious how you're implementing those principles in your own life." When AOC replied that she tried to live consistently with her values, Johnson sprung the trap. "I'm curious about your trip to San Francisco last month." "You flew first class," Johnson stated, holding up his tablet. The projection screen behind AOC suddenly displayed the evidence. Her American Express statement showing a $1,427 charge for a first-class ticket on Continental Airlines. The gasp from the audience was audible. This was not a theoretical debate. This was a receipt. Johnson mercilessly dissected the timeline, pointing out that she had 6 days to travel and could have taken a train or flown coach, but instead spent taxpayer money for extra legroom and free champagne. When AOC tried to deflect, claiming privacy concerns, Johnson calmly reminded her that these were public disclosures she had filed herself. He then broadened the attack. In the past 18 months, you've taken 42 flights. 28 of them were first class or business class, he read from his dossier. He contrasted her behavior with her rhetoric, asking why she flew to Miami for a beach vacation while telling coal miners to sacrifice their jobs. The logic was brutal. Either it's destroying the planet or it's not, Johnson posited. If it is, she should drive or take the train. If it's not, she should stop saying it is. You can't have it both ways. The interrogation moved to her car. Johnson brought up her $89,000 Tesla Model S, a vehicle she had previously described as a climate crime when driven by others. But the blow that truly landed wasn't about the price. It was about the supply chain. Johnson detailed the horrific conditions of cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where children as young as 6 work in toxic pits for $1 a day. Your car has a battery built with cobalt that was very likely extracted by child labor, Johnson said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent hall. When you bought that $89,000 car, did you know about the children in the Congo? AOC's non-answer. The supply chain for electric vehicles involves mineral extraction that is complicated, was devastating. A student in the audience, her voice trembling, cut through the spin. That's a yes. Johnson continued his relentless dissection. He brought up the tax the rich dress worn at the Met Gala, a $35,000 garment worn to an event for billionaires, contrasting it with the $56,000 median income of her constituents. He analyzed her housing costs, proving she spent well over the 30% income threshold she advocated for others because she chose to maintain 2 residences. Finally, he turned to campaign finance. He revealed that her campaign had paid over $200,000 to a consulting firm owned by her boyfriend, Riley Roberts, and another $180,000 to a firm owned by her former chief of staff. That's not people power, Congresswoman. That's a grift, Johnson declared. Part V. The collapse. The room, once filled with adoration, was now a cauldron of confusion and betrayal. Students who had idolized her were standing up, demanding answers. Did you pay your boyfriend's company money that people donated to your campaign? One asked. Is it true about the children? Another demanded. AOC looked at the faces of her supporters, young people who had donated their grocery money to her, and saw the light of belief extinguishing. She turned to Johnson, accusing him of an ambush. It's only an ambush if you can't answer the questions, he replied. Unable to regain control, AOC gathered her things and walked off the stage. Her heels clicked loudly on the floor in the silence, the sound of a leader abandoning her movement. She exited through the side door, leaving her supporters behind. But Johnson didn't leave. He stood before the stunned students and offered to show them the rest of the file. "Show us!" they cried. For the next 45 minutes, the Speaker of the House walked the young socialists through the reality of their heroes' finances, the corporate speaking fees, the book advances, the investments. The cognitive dissonance in the room resolved itself into a bitter realization. The woman they believed in was a brand, not a revolutionary. Part V's. The aftermath and legacy. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The students filmed everything, and the clips went viral instantly. The cobalt mines clip garnered 20 million views in 12 hours. The boyfriend's payments clip caused outrage among progressives who felt their donations had been squandered. The media, forced to cover the undeniable evidence, turned on her. The New York Times ran a devastating piece, verifying Johnson's claims. Her poll numbers collapsed, dropping 22 points among voters under 30 inches a single week. Two-thirds of her constituents no longer believed she lived by her values. A primary challenger, Maria Santos, a teacher who actually lived the working-class life AOC performed, rose to challenge her. Santos's slogan, "She walks the walk," highlighted the hypocrisy that Johnson had exposed. Despite a media blitz to defend herself, AOC lost the primary by 14 points, the largest defeat for an incumbent in modern New York history. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez eventually took a job as a political commentator, securing the comfortable life she had always enjoyed. But the movement she left behind learned a hard lesson that night in Georgetown. If you demand sacrifice from others, you must be willing to sacrifice yourself. As Mike Johnson's office stated in the wake of the event, "That's not partisan politics, that's basic integrity." The gap between her rhetoric and her reality had become a canyon, and in the end, it swallowed her whole. Part 7. The Internal Fracture. To fully understand the magnitude of the collapse, one must look beyond the public spectacle at Georgetown and into the claustrophobic confines of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign headquarters in the weeks that followed. The atmosphere inside the office, once vibrating with the infectious energy of a startup on the verge of an IPO, had curdled into something toxic and paranoid. The morning after the Georgetown event, the campaign office in the Bronx was eerily quiet. The usual hum of volunteers on phone banks was absent. The rows of desks, typically occupied by enthusiastic college students and local activists, were largely empty. The few staffers who had reported for work moved in silence, avoiding eye contact, their faces illuminated by the glow of monitors scrolling through an endless feed of negative commentary. In the conference room, the mood was funereal. Marcus Valdez, the communications director, had not slept. His eyes were rimmed with red, and a half-empty cup of stale coffee sat forgotten near his elbow. He was staring at a whiteboard that was usually covered in Path to Victory strategies. Now, it was covered in a list of media inquiries, each one more hostile than the last. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, 60 Minutes. They were no longer asking for profiles on the future of the Democratic Party. They were asking for comment on the FEC filings and the Tesla supply chain. Riley Roberts sat at the far end of the table. He had been the ghost at the feast since the moment Mike Johnson pointed him out in the auditorium. He looked diminished, shrinking into his hoodie as if trying to disappear. The revelation of the $212,000 payment to his firm, Cersa Strategies, had shifted the narrative from hypocrisy to corruption. While the payments were legal, the optics were catastrophic. Every time he tried to speak, to offer a strategy or a defense, the air in the room grew heavy. The staff knew that he was the anchor dragging the ship down. Yet his proximity to the Congresswoman made him untouchable. AOC herself was pacing the length of the room. The defiance she had shown on stage had morphed into a frantic, defensive energy. "We need to pivot," she said, her voice tight. "We need to get back to the issues. Stop talking about the car. Stop talking about the dress. Talk about the heat waves in Texas. Talk about the floods in California. If we ignore the noise, it will go away." "It's not noise, Congresswoman," Jen Fitzgerald, the press secretary, said softly. It was the first time anyone had dared to contradict her in months. "It's the signal. The calls coming in aren't from right-wing trolls. They're from our donors. They're from the unions. The Teachers Federation called this morning. They're putting a hold on their endorsement. The SEIU is asking for a meeting to clarify our stance on labor standards in the supply chain. We can't pivot away from this because our own people won't let us. The silence that followed was deafening. The realization was setting in. The coalition was fracturing. The intersectionality that AOC had championed, the idea that climate justice, racial justice, and economic justice were inextricably linked, was now being used against her. By driving a car built with child labor and flying first class, she hadn't just violated a climate pledge, she had violated the solidarity of the working class. Part 8. The rise of Maria Santos. While the incumbents' team was paralyzed by infighting and denial, a very different kind of campaign was taking shape just 3 miles away. Maria Santos had not intended to run for Congress. She was a 32-year-old civics teacher at a public high school in the Bronx. She spent her days trying to get teenagers interested in the Constitution and her evenings grading papers at her kitchen table. She had voted for AOC in 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024. She had believed in the revolution, but the Georgetown video had broken something in her. It wasn't just the hypocrisy, it was the arrogance. It was the supply chain is complicated comment. Maria taught her students that history is complicated, that policy is complicated, but that right and wrong are often simple. Exploiting children is wrong. Using donor money to enrich your boyfriend is wrong. She announced her candidacy not with a gala or a press conference, but with a smartphone video recorded on her walk to the subway. There was no lighting crew, no script writer, no makeup artist, just Maria in her winter coat. "I'm tired," she said in the video, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm tired of being told to turn down my thermostat by people who have never worried about a heating bill. I'm tired of being told to take the bus by people who fly private. I'm tired of politicians who use our district as a stepping stone to celebrity. I'm Maria. I'm a teacher. I make $68,000 a year. I don't have a Tesla. I don't have a Met Gala dress. I have a Metro card and a mortgage I worry about. If you want a representative who lives like you, vote for one of you." The resonance was immediate. The campaign slogan, "She walks the walk," was not created by a high-priced consultant. It was a comment left by a user on TikTok that went viral. Volunteers began to flock to Maria's campaign. Not the college students from NYU who usually powered progressive campaigns, but the grandmothers from the neighborhood, the bodega owners, the nurses who took the early bus. They saw in Maria something they had lost in AOC: authenticity. The debate, held 3 weeks before the primary, was the final nail in the coffin. It was a local affair, hosted by NY1, usually a low-stakes event, but the national eyes were watching. AOC arrived with a binder full of policy papers, ready to debate the nuances of federal appropriations. Maria arrived with nothing but a notepad. When the moderator asked about the Green New Deal, AOC launched into a polished, 5-minute monologue about carbon sequestration and international treaties. It was brilliant, intellectual, and completely detached. Maria waited for her to finish. Then she leaned into the microphone. "That sounds wonderful, Congresswoman, but the elevator in my building has been broken for 3 weeks. The subway station at 149th Street floods every time it rains. My students are learning in temporary trailers because the boiler in the main building exploded. We don't need a savior to save the planet in 2050. We need a representative to fix the Bronx in 2026. You're fighting for the world. I'm fighting for us." The line, "You're fighting for the world, I'm fighting for us," became the epitaph of the Ocasio-Cortez era. It crystallized the feeling that the Congresswoman had become a global celebrity who happened to represent a district, rather than a representative who happened to be famous. Part 9. The verdict of the voters. Election Day, June 23rd, 2026, was humid and overcast. The turnout was high. Driven by the intense national scrutiny, news vans from every major network were parked outside the polling stations. Pundits predicted a close race. The power of incumbency is difficult to break, and AOC still had millions of dollars in her war chest. But as the returns began to trickle in after the polls closed at 9 p.m., the story became clear. It wasn't close. In the precincts of Astoria and Long Island City, where the young, affluent professionals lived, AOC held her ground. These were the voters who worked in media and tech, who forgave the hypocrisy because they liked the aesthetic. But in the working-class neighborhoods in Parkchester, in Hunts Point, in Castle Hill, the bottom fell out. The voters who actually took the subway, who actually worried about the price of groceries, who actually had sons and daughters in the military or the trades, abandoned her en masse. They didn't care about her Twitter following. They cared that she had lied to them about who she was. By 10:30 p.m., the Associated Press called the race. Maria Santos, 57%. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 43%. The concession party, if it could be called that, was held at a trendy bar in Queens. The mood was angry. Supporters wept openly, blaming the corporate media, misogyny, and dark money for the loss. They refused to accept the reality that was staring them in the face. They had lost because their candidate had lost her moral authority. AOC's speech was brief. She looked shell-shocked. For the first time in her public life, the camera did not love her. It exposed her. She spoke about the forces arrayed against progress, about the difficulty of speaking truth to power. But she did not apologize. She did not acknowledge the specific grievances that had cost her the election. She remained, to the bitter end, convinced of her own righteousness. Part X. The lesson. In the months that followed, the political postmortems were endless. Think tanks held symposiums on the fall of AOC. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. But the lesson was simple, and it was the one Mike Johnson had articulated that night in Georgetown. Politics, at its core, is a trust exercise. Voters will forgive policy failures. They will forgive gaffes. They will even forgive scandals if they believe the politician is fundamentally on their side. But they will not forgive being looked down upon. They will not forgive a leader who establishes a hierarchy of virtue where the rules apply to the little people, but not the elite. AOC's fatal mistake was not buying a Tesla or flying first class. It was the belief that her good intentions exempted her from the consequences of her actions. She believed that because she was fighting for the right side of history, the details of her personal conduct were irrelevant. She forgot that for the single mother waiting for the bus in the rain, or the father working 2 jobs to pay rent, those details are everything. Mike Johnson didn't destroy her. He simply held up a mirror, and when the voters looked into it, they didn't see a revolutionary. They saw just another politician. As Maria Santos took the oath of office the following January, swearing to support and defend the Constitution, she did so wearing a suit she bought off the rack at Macy's. She took the train down to D.C. She refused the option to lease a luxury car. She kept her promise. And in doing so, she restored a small, fragile piece of faith in the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people could actually live like the people.